for it to go. So that can cause water to back up along the rivers and cause flooding. That, along with a lot of rain that comes from these hurricanes, can also cause an increase of water flooding into the rivers and into our water management systems, causing flooding as well. Public Works does a lot of work before the storm to make sure that our water levels are as low as possible so we can handle additional storm surge and flooding in our water systems. If you want additional information about that, we have a great video about our water control structures, and you can visit the Public Works website.
Good morning, everybody. Today's Monday, March 3rd, 2025. It's 10 a.m. We're in the city chambers, and I call the City Commission Workshop meeting to order. Commissioners present are Commissioners Duval, Commissioner Langdon, Mayor Stokes. Vice Mayor Emmerich is missing today, and Commissioner Petrov is in attendance, so there's a quorum present for this meeting. Also present, City Manager Fletcher, Interim City Attorney Golan, City Clerk Faust, Board Specialist Lane, Police Chief Garrison, and Fire Chief Titus are in the house. Ms. Kim, would you kindly do us the pleasure?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Righty. City Clerk, any public comments? There is none. So we'll move on to general business, 25-1950. Discussion and possible direction regarding the findings, the city fee structure study for fire rescue fees, park and recreation fees, facility rental fees, road and drainage fees, and utility fees conducted by Weldon Financial Services. City Manager, this is your item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We do want to thank our Finance Director, Kim Williams, for securing the services of the consultant of Willdan Financial Services. Here's the presentation to go over their findings, which was communicated and sent out as it was adjusted on the agenda last Friday. But now I'll turn it over to our consultant. We'll hear from him and then we'll have a discussion. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, members of the commission. My name is Dennis Gorel. I'm a project manager at Weldon. Today, we're going to be talking about the user fee study we recently completed. Before I get started, I want to make sure I thank all the staff that was involved in the process of this study. There's a lot of effort involved from staff on top of their heavy workload, so we want to make sure we thank them. And a special thanks to Tiffany Fowler for organizing and coordinating all the departments, which is not an easy task. So let's get started. So what are user fees? User fees are fees that fund services that provide a private benefit. And I want to highlight those words. Those are very important words. Private benefit to the individual requesting them with very limited to no benefit to the community as a whole. So what is a user fee study? The primary objective of a user fee study is to determine the full cost of providing each service. Each service in each department is calculated individually, and we discuss each service in each department with the staff members as well. To calculate the full cost of providing the services, we use what we call fully burned hourly rates. That includes salary and benefit cost, and on top of that, we layer the direct and indirect overhead, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. And of course, up to 100% may be recovered by the city. So what kind of information did we use to complete this study? We used department budgets, salary and benefit information, staffing structures, productive hours, time estimates for each single program or fee, current activity levels, and city staff interviews and policies. Let's talk a little bit about the methodology components of the user fee study here. We start with the data analysis portion, where we conduct department interviews, we gather time estimates, and we start building the labor costs. The next step of the process is building cost layers. The majority of the cost you incur is from the direct services and indirect services of providing this kind of service. On top of that, we layer the department overhead cost, which is the administration of your department, what it takes, what kind of materials and supplies does it take your department to operate. And lastly, we add on citywide overhead or indirect overhead. That is the overhead of the support that is being provided to your operating departments by the central services such as finance, IT, human resources. And lastly, we define the full cost of each service, and we try to talk about what kind of cost recovery goals and levels we want to reach with certain departments, because every department would want to reach different kind of cost recovery goals. Let's look at a typical fee composition here. Like I said, the direct cost is the majority of the costs you incur providing a service, which includes the direct labor, third-party costs, and material costs. On top of that, like I mentioned, we add the department overhead, which is the operational cost of the department, the supplies and materials within that department. And lastly, we add central service overhead, which is the support that is being provided from city managers, finance, IT, human resources, all those central service departments that need to support the operating departments. This is a very important slide here. I want to spend a little bit of time explaining this, right? So when you provide a service, you are incurring the cost of providing that service, whether you charge for it or you don't charge for it, right? Now, as the policymakers, you have to make a decision. Do you want to use tax dollars to subsidize the cost of providing the service? Or do you want to charge the individual requesting and receiving that private benefit, and you want to recover the cost from that individual? So you're going to get the cost no matter what. Now you got to make a decision. Do you want to use tax dollars to subsidize, or charge the individual. Let's take a look at some examples. Let's say the community is the only one really that's benefiting from this kind of service. Your cost recovery strategy should be primarily taxes and maybe a little bit of fees. An example of that would be police patrol. Now, if the benefit is primarily community, you want to use a mix of fees and taxes. An example of that would be code enforcement. Now, if the benefit is primarily individual, you want to try to recover as much of the cost with your fees and maybe some tax subsidy. An example of that would be parks and recreation. Now, if the benefit is completely individual benefit, you want to try to recover as much with the fees themselves. Example of that would be development services. So what kind of fees did we review? We looked at citywide fees, utility user fees, road and drainage fees, police fees, fire and EMS fees. Fire and EMS is a little bit unique, and when we get to those slides, I'll explain a little more, and parks and recreation fees. Let's start with citywide fees. Citywide fees is basically your city clerk fees for copies. The current cost recovery for citywide fees on average is 24%. The reason for that is that majority of those fees are set by Florida law. In reality, out of all the 9 fees we reviewed, there's only 1 fee that you had the possibility or the ability to change at all. So we reviewed 9 fees. We didn't need to add any new fees here. We increased 1 fee just to slightly increase the cost recovery. 7 fees are remaining the same, and we deleted 1 fee for something that is not being used anymore. That is part of our process as well. Any fees that are not used on the schedule, we want to clean them up, and any additional fees, we want to make sure we add those fees as well. So the average cost recovery after the increase will be about 27% on average for the fees. Let's take a look at your utility user fees. Utility user fees, I want you to understand, is different than your utility fees. So we are not looking or touching anything like your water bill, your sanitation bill, your wastewater bill. This is just direct private service from the utility fees. Your current cost recovery for utility fees is about 49%. The suggestions are to bring the cost recovery a little bit higher. We took a look at 17 fees. Here, we added 3 new fees for services that you are able to charge now, an additional service to the citizens. We increased 6 fees. 4 fees are remaining the same. And we also deleted 4 fees that are just not being used anymore to clean up the schedule. And the proposed average cost recovery with these increases would be about 66% of the cost. Let's look at roads and drainage fees. Your current cost recovery for roads and drainage is 50%. Here, we also want to bring it a little bit higher, the cost recovery. And with a total of 14 fees that we reviewed, we increased 8 fees. 6 fees are remaining the same. And the proposed average cost recovery is 67%. Let's take a look at police fees. Here, what I want to make sure to mention is with the police fees, this does not include your police patrol at all. This is just your police user fees. In reality, it's for fingerprint, it's for, I think, a handicap fine. So it does not include your police patrol at all. So when you see the average cost recovery for 42%, that's just for those user fees, not for the police patrol at all. Majority of the fees here on the police schedule are also set by Florida law, or they're just a direct pass-through fees here. Of course, the suggested fees are to raise the cost recovery a little bit higher. We looked at 13 fees. We increased only 2 fees here. 10 fees are to remain the same. We deleted 1 fee for something that was on the schedule that's not being used anymore. And the proposed average cost recovery for police fees is 51%. Here, let's talk about fire fees. Let me just grab a sip of water. Apologies. So with fire fees, the reason they're unique is because you have emergency services, and then you have fire basic fees like inspections. So we wanted to make sure we separate your fire basic fees from their emergency services. So when you see this recovery of 88%, majority of the fees here are dealing with fire inspections, new development, inspecting new buildings. This has nothing to do with your emergency services right now. But your current recovery for fire fees is 88%. the suggested fees, we felt like the cost recovery was pretty good here for fire. So we didn't really want to increase it or decrease it. We want to kind of remain the same level, but we wanted to make sure we adjust the fees based on their cost of service and just make sure we're basing them on their cost of service. Now, any fee that increased here is increasing basically just by CPIU of 2.7%. So the increases are very minor for the fees we are increasing. For fire fees, we looked at 146 fees. We added 2 new fees for additional services to the citizens. We increased 100 fees. I know it sounds like a lot, but again, those 100 fees are increasing basically just by inflation. We decreased 4 fees, and that's why you see that average cost recovery of 88% actually go to 87. In reality, they're pretty much the same, it's just in the decimals. It's because the decrease in fees, the percentage-wise, was much larger than the increase in the fees. 40 fees are remaining the same. And like I said, the proposed cost recovery for the fire fees, excluding emergency services, is remaining in that area of 87 to 88%. Now let's take a look at your emergency services. For emergency services, it is very unique. You can charge your full cost, but the insurance will only pay you a certain amount. So a lot of agencies do your EMS fees are based on kind of a market analysis of what are the surrounding cities charging around you. Again, any fee that we're increasing here is just an inflationary increase of 2.7%, which is very consistent with all your surrounding areas. And actually, I believe Longboat, Key, and Venice just recently did an increase as well for that. Now, the 7 fees we looked, we increased 6, and 1 fee is going to remain the same. Let's take a quick look at this market analysis here. For the first fee of basic life support, you currently charge $740. That is a little bit higher than the comparison cities here. So that is the fee we're not touching. In reality, the other cities and the other counties are going to reach that with only 1 pretty much inflationary increase. So in a year or 2, they'll be at that level. But for right now, we wanted to not increase it, just to make sure we're not, ahead of all the surrounding cities. Now, for advanced life support, you currently charge $800, which equals or below 3 out of 4 comparison cities. As you can see, Sarasota County is $823, Venice is $800, which is pretty much it. Longboat Key is $820. So this one, we're just doing a small inflationary increase. For level 2 of advanced life support, you currently charge $825. This one is very similar as well, where you're at or below 3 of the comparison cities. This one will also have a small inflationary increase. The per mileage charge, you're pretty much at Sarasota County, Venice, and Longboat. They have a pretty much same per mileage charge. We're just doing an inflationary increase for the per mileage charge. It's going to be a very minimal increase for that. Medical treatment without transport, you're at 3. You're the same as 3 of your comparison cities and actually below Sarasota County. So we're also doing just an inflationary minimal increase on that one. Now, when we get to this EMS stuff, ambulance waiting time, plus the additional time, that's a little bit unique because every city and every county charges a little bit different for the time. Some give you the first 30 minutes free, some charge you after 15 minutes, some have the increments of per 15 minutes, and some have increments per half an hour. That's why it's not really apples to apples here as much. But for Northport, you're currently charging, after the first half an hour, $123.76, which is pretty much below all the county and city comparisons here. So we're increasing that by the inflation. Now, with the staff waiting time and additional staff waiting time, I believe you charge for per 15-minute basis, where some of these cities might be charging per half an hour basis. So in reality, you're not really half their cost. They're just charging it in a different way, but you're still below them if you multiply it by 2, right? So you're gonna be at about $62, which is still below all the comparison cities here. So we're also doing just an inflationary increase on this fee as well. Let's take a look at Parks and Recreation. Park and Recreation is unique also because you don't have a cost recovery. The cost recovery here is different than the other departments in a sense, where in the other departments, it was individual fee average cost recovery, where here is the overall department cost recovery. So when you're looking at the overall department for Parks and Recreation, we wanted to exclude Warm Mineral Springs And we also wanted to exclude any expenses you spend on free events here as well. So your cost recovery for Parks and Recreation is at 22.66%. Now, your warm mineral springs and camp programs are recovering their cost of service. They're good. And lastly, for this, because this is kind of also, this is unique, we wanted to use comparisons, and staff had some very good comparisons that they took into account when setting the fees. We reviewed 194 fees. Majority of them are remaining the same. 109 fees out of 194. The reason for that is some of those fees had already been increased in the past year, and we didn't want to adjust the fees twice. We wanted to give a little bit of a break on those. Some of the fees are not being increased until you finish some renovations to make sure you can justify the increase in fees after the renovation. But overall, we looked at 194 fees. The new fees, we added 7 new fees for additional services you can provide to your citizens. We increased 72 fees, and the increases in fees in Parks and Recreation is very minimal. We went for the target of about 25% cost recovery, where you're about 22.66%. That means in about an estimated 10% increase on the fees. It's very minimal increase here. We didn't decrease any fees here, and we deleted 6 fees for services you're not currently provided, just to clean up the schedule here. Now, we looked at overall over 500 fees. Right? It's a lot of fees to look over. So we like to go over cost recovery standards, department cost recovery, and the general standard. If an individual is receiving a private benefit from a service, he should technically pay, or she, 100% what it costs the city of providing that service. Now, you have the policy decision to not charge 100, right? But that means anything below 100% of the cost of service, you're using tax dollars to subsidize the fee, right? Which makes sense in certain situations, of course. Whether you want to encourage participation, like with your Parks and Recreation program. If you want to ensure compliance, like with code compliance. If you want to allow access to the service, like with your library services. That's, for every city I work in, that probably has the lowest cost recovery. And I'm down to my last slide right now. There's a reason you're not seeing development services here. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the next steps for development services. The development services analysis had to be delayed a little bit because of a new unified land development code and the implementation of Acela, which basically changes the entire efficiencies and changes the entire way the department operates. And we didn't want to fill out the time estimates for that department when, in half a year or whenever you figure out the system, everything kind of changes, so it's going to be irrelevant anymore. So with that said, we're going to have to wait about a year from December 2024. That's when Acela was implemented. So the staff has a better understanding and better idea of the time estimate that it actually takes to produce or provide the services, and they can provide accurate time estimates. This was my last slide. Now, we have all the 500 fees with their cost of service, subsidy amount, cost recovery, and fee change for every single fee. And I would be happy to answer any questions or speak about any individual departments you would like to speak about.
Thank you very much. Commissioners. Langman.
Thank you, Mayor. Do you want us to do questions first and then comments, or just keep it loose, whatever kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, I think we can probably keep it loose.
I guess I'll do a couple questions first and you might have to time me.
I'll let you know when that plane needs to land.
In the user fee study and the methodology, did you ever consider including the depreciation of certain assets?
Depreciation is not included in a sense of the depreciation, but it is included in a sense of you having the budgeted numbers to replace, to maintain, and that kind of thing. So in reality, that should kind of offset the depreciation, and that's where we have the department overhead of all your maintenance, replacement, supplies, and services, so you can make sure you account for that somewhat.
I would make the case that in certain instances, the provision of service is very building-centric. So for example, in Parks and Rec, we have 4 very expensive assets that we manage. We have 2 community centers, we have the aquatic center, and we have Warm Mineral Springs. So let's talk about the springs for a minute. We are about to spend $10 million, give or take $1 million in either direction. If somehow we don't give visibility to that, we're doing the community a disservice because of the expense and the millions of dollars that have gone into that property. I guess part of what I'm feeling is for those 4 assets that I mentioned, again, because they're so building dependent and so expensive to maintain, that we need to reflect that. And so I was sort of thinking, do we try to capture the actual maintenance costs and build that into it? Do we take a look at the asset and just depreciate it? I'll let Ms. Kim figure out the best way to do that. But I think for those assets, we really need to build that in because they are very expensive. Now, whether we decide to recoup costs for that is a different conversation. But one of the things that I've learned in our conversations about the referendum with our community is we do have a group of people in the city who want the details. And when we say things like Warm Mineral Springs pays for itself, that is not accurate. We paid $5.5 million for it. We're on the brink of spending another $10 million to restore the buildings. We need to give visibility to that, to the community, and for us, so that we really understand the cost of providing these services. And for me, and I'll kind of digress a little bit, in the model, when we looked at Parks and Rec, I think you had said that Parks and Rec is primarily individual. I would challenge that. I think Parks and Rec has a very strong community-wide benefit. Now, we might have to look at some things separately, but I'll tell you, so much of what Parks and Rec does is for our children. And I don't know, any way you cut it, when we invest in our children, that's a community-wide benefit. So that kind of popped out at me as maybe not being the best way to view Parks and Rec. There might be some aspects. For example, I keep picking on Warm Mineral Springs. I don't mean to, but it's a very select group of people who participate and enjoy that asset. I would look at that very differently than I would our playing fields or even some of our community buildings, which provide a lot of services for our kids. So I just wanted to point that out. I'd be interested in how my fellow commissioners look at that. I have more, but I'll kind of keep quiet and see if anyone wants to pick up on either of those 2 themes.
Anybody else? Commissioner Duval?
I'm going to tag along with Barbara here. I don't want anyone to think I'm picking on Parks and Rec, but there are so many different facets to Parks and Rec. One statement that you made was that the user should pay 100% of the cost. Well, at Parks and Rec, we have a community of people that use Warm Mineral Springs. But because of our geographic lines, a good share of that community that uses it does not live in the city of Northport. And we do have a difference between fees for residents and non-residents. And that's part of an issue where a part of that community that uses it, in the long run, we'd kind of like to annex them in to our community. They live close to
Mhm.
Warm Mineral Springs, but they don't live in the city. Another part of that idea of the user should pay the cost of the service. Well, if we set the cost of the service, an hour of use of a basketball court at $100, well, if the cost is $100, we charge $100. But what about a non-resident? Do we pay them extra, or do we charge them extra? That's just a question. Now, one of the other statements that you made was that Florida law sets a majority of fees. Should we, as a question for my fellow commissioners, should we look at maybe mimicking the state? Just a question, as far as, do they get a recovery of 50% on something and we get 25, maybe we should go to 50. Or if we get 75, maybe we should go down to 50. Another little thing, this is a pet project of mine. I noticed our utilities recovery fee is set at 49%. Now, we do have in this city on people's electric bills a 10% tax for the city, plus a franchise fee. Now, if I go to a store and buy something, basically I pay about 7% sales tax. The city doesn't really do anything to provide that electricity. FPL does. But we're getting 10% plus a franchise fee. Now, some of those fees, just lately, FPL has announced they're requesting more money. And my suggestion, this is something that I'd like to see happen with us later on, is as those fees go up for FPL, we could lower, like say this year, if they raise the fee by this amount, we should be able to lower our tax from 10% to 9% and still receive the same amount of money for the city. Because their fees are going up, we're now taxing at 9% on a higher amount versus 10% at a lower amount. Plus, we're continually adding a number of homes each year to the amount. So what we could do in the long run is, as the utility fees, and I'm talking purely FPL here, okay, because there are other utility fees that are kind of in a different category, but as FPL's rates go up, we should be able to lower that tax down to about that 6-7% range, like people pay on everything else they pay. Okay, I'm off my soapbox.
Commissioner Lang.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to a couple of things you mentioned, Commissioner McDowell. One was, should we,
McDowell.
I'm sorry, I'm so used to having Commissioner McDowell here. Duval, Commissioner Duval, should we mimic state or county fees? I've never been comfortable charging what other municipalities charge without considering cost of service delivery or quality of those services. So just for example, I do not lose sleep charging more for our emergency services, because I know we don't like to say this in public, but I'm not running for reelection again, so I'll say it in public. We provide a higher level of service in a lot of areas in this city, particularly compared with counties, and that shouldn't surprise anyone. Some people want to live in a city, though it's more expensive, because cities do in general have a higher level of service. But I do think it's important when we consider raising our fees to look at what surrounding communities are doing with those fees, just as a reality test. Because if someone's charging, and I'm making all of this up, $20, and we're thinking of charging $100, then maybe they're grossly under collecting. We may or may not want to under collect to the same level, but I would have to ask, are we delivering that service in the most efficient way? So I'm not comfortable with out of the gate a cost plus. I want to look at that cost and make sure that we're doing things in a very cost-effective way. And if we are, then, that sort of relieves a burden from my mind in raising fees. So I know efficiency isn't part of this conversation, I don't think, but at some point we need to look at that. When I was, and I'll pick on building services for a minute, when I was running for election and re-election, I talked to some residents of the city who, one gentleman said he put a shed up, pulled a permit, put a shed up on his property. And to close out the permit, of course, it had to be inspected. One inspector came out to make sure that the resident had respected, boundaries and that kind of thing, that it was located in the right place. And then he had to wait a few more days for a different person to come out and make sure that the tie downs were sufficient. So that kind of worried me a little bit, that we were approaching that particular thing in the most cost-effective and efficient way. So that would sort of be one of my things. The service fee, we did approve a couple of years ago, I think it was, going up to the maximum service fee that municipalities are allowed to charge on things like electricity. We went to 100%. I think municipalities can also put a little surcharge on gas and a couple of other things. And the thought process was it's either that or raise millage property taxes. So it was sort of for us a trade-off. Now you can say whether that was a good trade-off or not. That would be an interesting conversation. But that's the decision we made at the time. So anyway, I'll keep quiet. That's just sort of my 2 cents on what Commissioner Duval brought up.
Commissioner Duval.
Yes, I forgot to mention a couple of things that I had intended on mentioning. And again, with Parks and Recreation, our Parks and Recreation Department provides a lot of services that we do not charge for. We have a number of kayak launching sites around this city. I've used them myself. There's nobody there selling me a ticket. Okay, that's quote unquote an unrecoverable cost to the city. The city can charge taxes. We have a lot of hiking trails that are built and maintained. We have a lot of playgrounds. The playgrounds right over here by the Mullins Center, every time I've looked, there's a large group of children using that. And nobody pays a fee every time they bring their kids there. So Parks and Recreation has got to be able to recover some of those fees without actually, having a ticket booth there. One more thing I'd really like to mention is a few days ago, a resident got in touch with me and wants to put some pavers on the back of his new home and have an area screened in. And he went through the process and everything was approved except for one item. Well, over the weekend, I was able to actually get on our new Acela program. Oh my God, it's a miracle. I'm new here and I haven't learned how to use my Apple phone yet. But I was able to get on Acela, look at all the approvals for that project he has, and find the one part of that approval that hadn't gone through yet. And I was able to say, hey, that approval, that goes to planning and zoning. And I was able to meet that gentleman here early this morning and say, there's the door to their office. And a few minutes later, he sent me a text, and that text said, hey, we're on our way. I think Acela was an excellent investment. Number one, that it was user-friendly to an old guy who technology is, you know, a foreign language. And number two, you know, how quick it gave the information that was needed. Thanks.
I have a couple questions, comments. On a couple of these, I guess it was the overall city fees and police fees you indicated. The state sets those. Are we still considerably under what the caps are there? How does that work? Are we allowed only to increase a certain percentage each year? Is that how that works?
No, there's a cap, and you are at the cap for those fees.
Okay.
Mhm.
So our costs, based on the recovery, our actual costs are way in excess of what the caps.
Yes, yes.
Don't know whether or not the scope of your study looked into why is it's costing us so much more than what the state says it should cost us.
That's not what the state is not saying what it should cost you. They're just putting caps because those are community. A lot of these services are just something a city has to offer, like copy of their charter, certain copies of things that you request for public information requests. It's not that the state is saying this is what it should cost you. I wanted to make sure that is very clear.
But the state sets a cap. It says you can't charge any more than that.
Mhm.
But yet our actual costs obviously are in excess of that, since based on your category report there, we're not recovering our costs. Am I misunderstanding?
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, you're not currently recovering your costs.
So then why are we providing services for which we can't get reimbursed? If we can't recover our costs, why are we providing those services?
State mandated services.
Well, let me try again. So
Unfunded mandate.
So the state mandates we provide the services, but it doesn't allow us to recoup our costs.
That's correct. But again, your full cost calculation takes into account your staff effort as well, where the state might be calculating just how much is a one-sided copy, just the paper itself, right? Yours also includes the staff effort of time talking to the customer, getting the service done. That's why it's a little bit higher here.
I got you. All right, at least I understand it. When it comes to Parks and Recs, while I appreciate that 25% recovery is kind of, of all the categories, of all the areas throughout the city seems so horribly low, and oh my God, why aren't we recovering more? I am an advocate of quality of life, and I know that it's pretty hard to recover the costs for ball fields and some park-like areas. And I'm not so sure I'm a big advocate of charging a lot more for some of the parks and recreational services that might well dissuade people from using them. People who may not have a lot of money, can't afford their own pool, can't afford their own this, that, or the other, use a public service because it's affordable. But the area in which, I have shown some concern, and I have concern, is our inability so far to find and develop programs and events that are real revenue producers. And I think that that may be a way to help offset some of the difficulty we have recovering our costs. I just believe that when it comes to our, whether it's the Aquatic Center or whether it's the Mullen or Morgan centers, we have to make a huge effort to create programs and events that are going to generate big revenue generators that can help offset some of the costs to provide the rest of the services to people who can't afford them, who we want to continue to offer those services to. So that's maybe a conversation for another day, but that's sort of where my head's at on it. As we try to see how this is going to fit, at least we did one thing from last year when we kind of looked at adjusting some fees, and there was criticism about the fact that we didn't do this in a methodical, professional way. We didn't hire someone to do it. We've addressed that. And what it's clearly shown and should show everyone who looks at this is that our fees are still sorely undercosted or underpriced compared to what the cost of providing the services are. So wherever we can, we should try to adjust them up. But, whether we do it all at once or whether we phase it over a period of time, I think part of that's got to be, looked at in conjunction with our budgeting season, our budgeting cycle this year, and to see how this works. I don't know whether we want to try to talk about, we want to ask staff to do a couple of different scenarios, a 50%, 100% of the recommended increases here as into how that affects our budget. How are we going to use this? That's where I would like to see the conversation go. We got a professional study that's recommending increases. Do we just say, yeah, let's do them? Or do we want to see, what half of that would look like in this next budget cycle and what all of it would look like, and see what the difference is and what the revenue differential is or lack thereof? What do you guys think? Commissioner Petro, you're up.
Thank you, Mayor. Few things I want to address, and then open up a couple questions to my fellow commissioners. You mentioned, sorry, how much of you did a good presentation and presented us with cost of service. Now, did you look at any quality of service of each service being provided?
That's something we don't look. We don't look at the quality or efficiency of the services. We're not operators. We're finance folks. So we we concentrate on the cost.
Sure. But cost can be brought up easily by just, advocating for a new service, and that service is not being utilized or used, and then you doing your finance thing and cost recover. And that might not be efficient at all. I'm an efficiency guy, so can you tell me, have you looked at any efficiency policies or any efficiency services in the study at all? Or did you encounter while doing the study, hey, this could be combined, therefore we can recover much more percentage of a recovery cost?
We didn't look at individual efficiencies. We did talk with staff about their operational knowledge of what kind of services, and that's why we added some new services. That's why we deleted some services, but we didn't do an analysis on the efficiency.
Mm-hmm. In my opinion, one thing cannot go without the other one. I think efficiencies have to be incorporated, and that's something we can look into the future studies as a recommendation to the staff. Because if we have services that are not being utilized and yet we pay for them, just a simple example, we hire more people, we think it's going to be a great service for the community. We realize later down the road that it's not really utilized, but yet we keep the employees. Thus, we have to recover more money. Thus, we raise the fees. Thus, we charge more. So you see where I'm getting? So I think it has to be, as a consultant, and I'm not getting into operational branch of our city, but as a policymaker, we have to look at the entire picture to look what services are effective, what services are efficient, and thus. But I see you, Kim, go ahead.
Good morning, Kim Williams, the Finance Director. So while this wasn't a study to come in and look at the efficiency of the different areas, I think it does speak a little bit to it. If you look at a comparable cost recovery for Parks and Rec is what, 20 to 30% normally. So you can, with our fees not being outrageously higher than other areas or lower, it does speak to us being compared to other governments. We hear with these adjustments, we'll be recovering 25%. That speaks to our efficiency being very similar to other governments. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, to some extent.
And then, of course, Parks and Rec is not designed to fully recover.
Mhm.
We're not a for-profit entity. Government is here to provide those services for the greater good and not at a full cost recovery. We're just a different setup.
And that leads me to another question, and I might not be very articulate in this sense, but as far as how much of the user fee is structured into the pool of expense, as far as you have your own budget, for example, let's take Parks and Recreation. You get picked on it. How much of a user fee or how much of a recovery cost is incorporated, or how do you differentiate between the budget that comes in and the user fee, or is the user fee strictly depends on the user that uses that
The
service?
service, yes. And I can I think I know what you're asking.
Did you? I don't
I
know
think
if
I
I'm
do.
really articulate on that question.
Yes.
As far as the budget, I don't want to be overlapping the expenses and charge people more than we should.
Of course.
Maybe we should utilize our budget in a better way and not charge separate, and not increase user fees every year or whatever.
The only department in our study here that was based directly on budget recovery is Parks and Recreation. And the reason for that is there is no real cost calculation for each individual fee. For example, someone gets a membership. There is no real cost calculation. The cost calculation comes directly from the staff time involvement and materials or any third party that is used, right? So the only one that was based directly on budget is Parks and Recreation. Now, all the other departments, the budget comes into account by adding the department overhead. But the real cost is calculated based on the salary and benefit position. So even adding an additional staff member doesn't really change that as much, because we're looking at that specific position that is doing the service, and then we account for the budget by adding the department overhead and the indirect overhead. But only Parks and Rec is directly based on all the budget expenses and revenues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that leads me back to the efficiency processes or policies. In your discussion with the staff, how much time did you devote into the asking, hey, are we repeating this service through the other service, or are these services overlap?
We tried, that goes a little bit into our study. We made sure that there is no overlapping fees in different departments. We made sure that if there are, we delete some of them. But again, that is pretty much, we did have a little bit of discussion based on what is their cost, what is the other cities are charging, and that kind of gives you a little bit of a measure of efficiency. But again, we didn't look at direct efficiency of every service you provide. We did not do that. Yeah.
Well, as a policymaker, by the city charter, we are restrained from going into operational management or hiring consultants. But for the future, I would like to see some efficiency studies incorporated into the user fee recovery, cost recovery. Because in my opinion, when we get contacted by the citizen, they ask us, hey, my fee has been increased. Can you do something? What can I say? I really can't, but this is the time when we are allowed to discuss and make recommendation or make a policy change by the majority. But for the future, I would like to see some efficiencies studies incorporated in this presentation, which by the way is a good presentation. But as I don't think one can go without the other one. I mean, we have to combine efficiencies and utilize the services to the fullest extent. Trying to incorporate or make it more effective as a city as a whole. And one other question for you, and then I'll have more questions to my fellow commissioners. I'm sure you've done many other studies for other cities and municipalities. In your experience, are we below or more or over? How will we be recovering our costs?
Of course. Every department, like I mentioned a little earlier, has their own kind of cost recovery and cost recovery goal. With Parks and Recreation, you're a little bit below than what I've seen from other cities. Pretty much all your fees except your fire inspection fees, which again are for development, right? They're not emergency, are recovering a little bit less than the average I see in other cities. That with the fire inspection fees, I think you're pretty much in the area where I see a lot of the cities. A lot of the cost recovery I see from most departments is between 60 to 80%. And if it's development services, majority of the time I see 80 to 100% with that.
So can I interrupt? So for the Parks and Recs, we can say that they're doing a good job.
They're trying to provide as much community services as they can for the community. And that kind of, if I could maybe answer a little bit of the non-resident and resident here, the reason you want to charge non-residents a little bit higher is because the residents, if you're a resident, you're paying tax dollars.
Sure.
So if you're not charging your full cost, your tax dollars is being used to recover it. Now, if you're non-resident, you're not paying tax dollars to, subsidize or help out with the cost. And that is the reason that almost every single city has a non-resident and resident separate and a little bit higher for the non-resident. That's because their tax dollars are not helping to subsidize or help out with any of the community services in the city.
And the other ones, are we more or less in line?
All the other ones, you're pretty close. Like I said, majority of fees, like roads and drainage, I see 60 to 80. You're at 50, you're a little bit below. You're below with majority of your departments except the fire development fees, which you are pretty much in the average that I see from other cities.
It would be a good time to comment our Parks and Recs department. The couple questions to my fellow commissioners, if I may.
Certainly.
The question that was brought by Commissioner Duval about the FPL, and I've heard same thing from that they're going to increase the rates. We as a policymaker should look into kind of lower that. And we at the max, plus there's a franchise fee, which does not correlate to the services that we provide as a city. So I just want to make sure that we look into that. And a lot of residents are concerned about that issue, that they're being charged on their FPL bill, whereas they don't get any services from the city. I mean, it's just another tax, let's be honest. And and I know the inflation grows and expenses are going up, but we have to also look not only at the revenue side, but also at how can we cut, not the services, but minimize or make it more efficient for the city to substitute that cut that we charging the citizen. And when I say we, say as a city, because people pay it to the city.
I may,
Okay.
if I can address Commissioner Petro. You packed a lot in there, so let me just sort of separate out the FPL fee. I agree. I'm I'm a value add person. So I'm a great supporter of where we add value that we charge for it. I'm reluctant to charge where we don't add value. So I hear what you're saying. But again, when we made the decision to increase that to 10%, it was in lieu of impacting our property tax rate. So I would very much like to revisit charging those surcharges on those utilities that the state allows us to, like FPL. But we need to have that conversation at the same time we look at our millage rate, because it was a clear trade-off. You either raise one or the other. If you decrease one, it has an impact on what we do in other areas. So yes, I would like to revisit that, but it needs to be in the context of what we're charging from a property tax point of view. Efficiencies, I'm right there with you. It's more my style, where I've observed things where I personally felt we could be more efficient, or when community members came to me and shared stories of where they felt the city could have been more efficient. I'll have that conversation with city manager. We all should have that conversation with city manager. And as perhaps part of our budget conversation, if the five of us are sort of concerned in similar areas, then maybe we bring that efficiency conversation back, either as part of budget or as an agenda item, or whatever is most appropriate. I personally am reluctant to have those conversations at this stage in public.
But at least we should mention that we are for efficiency.
But it's important that we be efficient. So that's sort of in response to Commissioner Petro. I also had some comments I wanted to share with the mayor, things that he brought up, if I may continue. One of the things you talked about was we need to be more entrepreneurial. That's how I describe it. When we take a look at our very expensive assets, like War Mineral Springs or the Aquatic Center, then we really need to think about, if we want to keep what we charge the community low for those amenities, then we need to get creative as a city, as staff, as commissioners, in terms of how do we utilize those assets in a way that helps recoup some of those costs. I think enough said on that. I've had a lot of conversations with staff over the past few years, particularly in the past year, on that specific item. And back to Parks and Rec, because I think we've all, and I'm sorry, we're sort of picking on Parks and Rec, but it's an interesting conversation to have, because there's such a, in my mind, a dichotomy in what we provide there. Clearly, our playing fields, our parks, I call them jungle gyms. I don't know what you call them today. You know, the structures that our kids play on. Even though I choke a little bit every time we replace one of those, because it's between $300,000 and $400,000. I don't think the community realizes just how expensive that is. And Parks and Rec is the third biggest consumer of our general fund, which is fueled by property taxes. So it does deserve some scrutiny. How I come down on it is our playing fields and our parks with the jungle gyms. I would move that in terms of our methodology to having primarily community benefit. I am 100% okay with not recapturing those costs. That is just something that so benefits all of us when we invest in our kids. But I come back to those very costly assets that are enjoyed by a subset of our community, very costly for us to provide Um, And we need to look at those. I would like to go through an exercise, and maybe we might need to do a consensus on this, but for those 4 assets, the Aquatic Center, Warm Mineral Springs, and our 2 community centers, I want to see a P&L on those. I mean, I'd like to run them either as, well, let's say a cost center, but let's really embrace all of the costs that go along with maintaining those properties. And whether we try to capture maintenance costs or just a depreciation, we need to see those things, because when we talk to the community about these assets, it's important that we understand the real costs of managing those assets, and we can share that information with the community. You know, our aquatic center currently loses about $600,000 a year. Maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. I would also say that I'm a hiker, and I go to a lot of state parks in multiple states. I enjoy that kind of thing. That might shock a lot of people. I think they think I live for concrete, but I don't. I love nature, and I love hiking in places. You go to a state park, there's a user fee. You go to other state parks that I've been to, there's not a user's fee, but there's a charge for parking. Now, we may or may not want to do that, but there are a lot of examples of how other municipalities and governmental entities make an attempt to collect some cost recovery from the subset of the community that utilizes that. And so I think for me, that's part of the equation. And again, just to recap, again, with Parks and Rec, I can accept a lot of what Parks and Rec does as having primarily community benefit, and I don't think of it in terms of cost recapture. But when we get to those very expensive things where only a small subset of our community enjoys it, we need to get smart on how we provide those. Done.
Question for you.
Yes, sir.
Did you take a look at, if all these proposed fees were to be adopted, what the additional annual revenue would be, what the additional generated revenue would be based on, say, this past year's worth of usage level? In other words, could we say this is going to add $1 million, $500,000, $2 million, $5 million? Do we have any idea what the adoption of these fees would generate in the way of revenue annually?
The actual revenue increase is very hard to calculate unless we have every single service, every single fee have its own, how many people used it, and how much revenue. Because not every fee is increasing at the same level. If the fees were increasing all at the same level, it'd be very easy to kind of estimate how much additional revenue. But when you have, for example, 72 fees that are remaining the same, and then 70 fees that are increasing, we need how many users for each single fee. And some of this, out of all the studies I've done, cities don't have that very accurate data unless they know to keep track of it, which of course costs more money to keep track of it.
I gotcha, so we have no idea. I mean, everybody brought up some very good thoughts and ideas the way I see it. Certainly from creating greater efficiency at the operating levels of our various departments to being more entrepreneurial in terms of adding programs and events so that we can offset some of the costs of providing the basic amenities and quality of life services. This all still ties right back into our overall budgeting process. And I don't know how you have the conversation of one without the other. I mean, we're here in a workshop to review these proposed fees. Beyond a general direction to staff to take these and integrate them into the budget process and see how that overall budget shakes out. I mean, I don't know how we can do much more than that. That's why I asked the question, how much revenue do these produce? And nobody knows. We don't really know. We can probably try to ballpark something, but I don't know how accurate. I wouldn't venture to say that this is going to generate more than a couple of $1 million worth of annual revenue. I'd be surprised if it even generated more than $1 million worth of revenue, but that's just me, okay? And I have no, actual foundation for making that statement, just a gut feel that it wouldn't be that overwhelmingly significant. So, one, we have the issue, where do we go from here? We can talk about all these things on infinitum. They really tie back into the budget. My strong belief here is that we as a city, this is the year to tighten that belt to the point where it hurts. And I think that that message is transmitted already. At least it has been from me to city manager. I would assume it's come from other commissioners as well. I would certainly hope it has, because we have some real challenges in the way of capital expenditures. We're asking our citizens in a referendum to assess themselves to pay $115 million for police headquarters. And I got to tell you this, we all, as a city government, are going to have to squeeze till it hurts for the next couple of years until we see, as the FPL study showed, or the our outside PFM study showed, that we're going to see some appreciable revenue increases down the road. For the next couple of years, they don't come home to roost yet. But yet, we're asking citizens to pay more now to help with some of these major projects that can't wait. And so I would say that, we're all looking at a real lean year or two, and we need to figure out a combination of where can we cut to the bone and where can we be more entrepreneurial to generate revenues in areas we haven't done before. That combination hopefully will balance our budget and save the taxpayers some money, because there needs to be some relief. If the average citizen just says, it goes up, it goes up, it goes up, you want to raise my fees, you want to raise my taxes, you want me to special assess myself for a police headquarters. I mean, when is enough enough? I think the city, we all collectively as our city government, we need to give something back to the citizens this year. We need to find a way to roll back that millage rate. We need to find a way, more than just slash away at the budget. We need to return some of it to them. And I'm saying it here now, I'm going to say it in every budget meeting that we have right through this cycle. This is the year that we need to find that balance. We're asking our citizens to make a huge sacrifice, and they want to see us make a huge sacrifice as well. Commissioner Langdon.
I see city manager on the board, and I've been flapping my jaws. I see
CM.
Commissioner Duval.
CM,
I'll come after
you
Commissioner.
get priority, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was just wanting to point out that the amount of revenue from the utility and franchise tax total roughly about $11 million. So if we do affect those numbers, that is the amount that you're looking for that will be affected by our budget compilation. The question about how much would the revenue increases raise? Of course, we don't know that, as we said, right now, but we're happy to bring you back scenarios during the budget process that will sort of outline those numbers. Even though these fees are being recommended to be raised to ensure that they are in better alignment with the industry averages or best practices, we still have the building fees to do next year. So if we don't recognize and catch up for these fees, and let's say those fees are over, and then you end up lowering those fees, I don't see how we can sort of balance a budget if everything that we're being given to aid us in balancing the budget without affecting the millage rate is going to help us continue the quality of services that we're providing. What I'm hearing is something has got to give, and what's going to give are going to be the services that we provide as we do get you to the number that you are trying to accomplish, but we are prepared to give you better detail and more conversation during the budget as it evolves. But just wanted to make a few of those points clear. Thank you.
And just to address your comment, I don't disagree. There's no way to tighten the belt sufficiently without it affecting levels of service. And I would expect that staff will be prepared to lay that out for us and show what it would mean if we were to, and what the implications are. You know, we're gonna have to make those tough decisions as to whether or not we consider the costs, savings, or the budget cuts, or the rollback of any property tax rates offset, and, you know, the hit to services, because there is no doubt that there is not a tremendous amount of fat, if at all, in this budget, despite what the public may think from time to time. We run a pretty tight ship, we really do. But I'm saying that something has to give. And if we were to do this, we're gonna need to understand what the hit to services are gonna be, how it's gonna affect our citizens if we were to cut back. But I gotta tell you, I believe we need to look hard at this and have a real serious discussion. And these fees play into that. You know, how much we increase them, everything's gonna play a part. We're gonna be impacted by, and I'm taking this conversation a little beyond the scope of this meeting, but, you know, let's face it, we've got homestead exemption numbers that are going up. We're not gonna see property appreciation what it was in past years. All that is gonna have an impact on our revenues and consequently on what decisions we make on expenses. But, you know, it'll be a very interesting budget process this year. Commissioner Duval.
Thank you, Mayor. There's so many different issues here. Included in this meeting's paperwork with some background material, and one thing I looked at here was the citywide fee structure as it is today. And this was from an ordinance 2024-34. And there's 44 pages. Now we're kind of having a macro discussion here. And these 44 pages are kind of micro, but there are some things to look at. Some of these are, you know, little things, but every penny counts. I'm looking at page 1 of that ordinance on citywide fees. And it says that a DVD is 30 cents per DVD. A compact disc is 25 cents. Well, number one, those are both getting to be pretty much obsolete technologies. I don't know how many people use them. But if this city is willing to give me a CD for 25 or 30 cents or a DVD, I'll sell them on eBay. There'll still be people that'll want them. What I'm saying is, I think we need an update on some of these things. You know, I was on our city charter review board, and I noticed there's a copy of the City of Northport Charter is $3 a copy. Well, that copy of the city charter, the ones I got when I was on the board, they've got a plastic binder on them, 2 cardboard things. Somebody had to put those together. That takes time. And for $3, that's pretty cheap. So I'm just using this as an example. There are 44 pages of city fees. And obviously we can't go through them all today. But I think, you know, we can spend time looking at things. And the mayor is totally correct. Our next couple of years, with the increases that we're asking the taxpayers to pay for things that we need, for infrastructure that we need, that's difficult enough. But when you add in some of the chaos that's coming to us from up above, from the state level, from the federal level, a lot of things that we may have been able to count on before, we're not sure if we're going to be able to count on. And I'm talking about federal grants, loans, low interest loan, we just don't know. So we have to be extremely careful in balancing what we're spending versus what we're charging. This is going to be a difficult process. Thank you.
Mr. Langdon.
I would just ask, does city manager want to go first? And no? Just one final comment. And it speaks to, let's get creative, let's be more entrepreneurial in how we approach things. In the past, Northport was not a desirable place to be. And in all honesty, if we didn't do it, if the city didn't pay for it, there was no profit-making or business that wanted to come here for lots of reasons that we don't have to go through today. That has changed. And with that, we need to think about, are there some services that we're providing or some services at a low cost that we're providing that we no longer need to do because we have businesses coming here who provide those things. And so I think one of the ways to test is if we increased the prices we charge for some of these assets, would there be a very immediate and sharp decline in demand? I'm using business terms, but you get what I'm saying. And for me, that would be a very telling piece of data to have. So, for example, we maintain 2 gyms in our community centers. Do we still need to do that? We have Planet Fitness opening up on Tamiami in the old Winn-Dixie building. They charge $12 a month. Do we still need to provide that for the community? And I think there are other examples. We have restaurants opening up with meeting space. You know, we always historically in this city, we've had a belief that if the city didn't do it and pay for it, then our residents wouldn't have it. And that was pretty accurate 10, 15 years ago. Not so accurate today. So efficiency is certainly part of it. How much cost we want to recapture. I think I like staying at the macro level. I'm not paid enough to figure out how to do it. That's why we have staff. But again, taking a look at certain things and determining where on this user fee policy consideration they fall. And things that are really individual, we either need to charge for it so we recapture our costs and or find a business maybe that would come in and do it for us. Anyway, I'm just throwing out some thoughts. And I want to be clear. I'm not supportive of a cost plus automatically charging the max in user fees. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if we choose as a board and as a government to keep our user fees low, then we need to get really creative on things we can do to recapture some of those costs and or increase our efficiency in delivering those things. And let me just say, I've always been impressed with the Aquatic Center in that you guys just had such a handle on your usage and, you know, days of the week and times of the day and sort of matching, are you open, are you not open? I really like that way of approaching things, and we need to do more of it. So I'm done. I've said everything I can say.
Yeah?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one clarification as you, as a board, give us guidance on the conversation that led back to Parks and Recs and the cost recovery in the buildings and the depreciation. when we do that, do you want us to do that only for Parks and Recs? Because the other fees on there, such as police and fire, they have buildings attached to them as well. Do you want to see something that comes back with all of those ones that include buildings, or just Parks and Recs?
I would just say for me, the indirect costs, so that model of direct and indirect costs, I would assume that some of those indirect costs would capture the buildings that house our fire and police personnel, for example. For me, it's more, what are those assets in the community where we're delivering services that are building specific or facility specific? Whether or not we charge for a fire station, if we don't do it, we don't, I mean, we have to do it to provide the service. But if we're not providing a gym, if we're not renting out space, then we don't need a community center. So some services are just very facility-based in my mind, and it's just poor Parks and Rec. That's the most obvious one. There might be others if we thought about it, but those are really, from a user fee perspective, the most obvious in my mind.
Could you clarify again, when you say the other departments, say that again so I understand what you're asking.
When you look at the information that the consultant provided today, you go through other departments with fees. You got EMS, you have fire, you have police, even road and drainage. But there are still buildings attached to those departments that have these fees. But with Parks and Recs, as Commissioner Langdon just said, essentially, if those buildings go away because they're not mandatory to provide, then
Right.
essentially the cost goes away.
Right.
But with those, they're different because they are mandated based on what they provide. If I recap what you
Yeah,
said.
I think that's
accurately.
that's
Right, so that's what makes them different as it relates to how we perform the exercise that we believe you're gonna want us to do, which is to sort of scrub down deeper into Parks and Recs to see what, I think you referenced it as a pro forma earlier, Commissioner, as to see more details of the revenues and
what it
expenses.
really costs to provide those facilities.
But when you asked, do we want us to do that? Do we want staff to do that for the other departments? Why would we not want to do that for every department? I'm missing something here.
Well, based on what she just explained, I would be going on the assumption that you're only talking about Parks and Recs because the facilities they provide, when they charge a revenue to get into them and use them, if that goes away and then you have the building that goes away, you don't have to provide a Morgan Center for a basketball court or for a gym or for a meeting space.
If I may,
No,
let me
but-
say it a different way. This might help you, Mayor. For those services, if you look at, it's not page numbered, but the user fee policy considerations, those services that are who benefits the community, I don't feel a need to do that. We cover that primarily through taxes. I don't feel a need to go to that level of granularity for those assets that benefit the entire community and are today funded primarily through taxes. It's as you move down that food chain to those assets that are primarily individual and individual, that's the area where I have some concern because it's user fees. How much do we want to use property taxes to help fund those? Those are the areas where I think we can get more creative in how we fund them. Does that help?
To a degree, but are there not some overall city services that we are providing that we might want to take a look at not providing anymore? I mean, I don't know in these other areas. I mean, are there things we can do with that? Commissioner Duval brought up a couple of examples, in the overall general fees without going one by one through 40 some odd pages or whatever they are. I mean, are there some things we should just not be doing? Can we just cut out? Can we just say, no, we're not gonna supply this or that or the other? If the law doesn't require us to do it, do we need to do it? I mean, the reality is somewhere we're gonna, I mean, you got two opportunities here. One is to continue to charge more and more for everything we do and provide. The other alternative is to cut expenses everywhere we possibly can. Or obviously the third is a combination of the two, which is the reality. So I'm just wondering, do we not want to look hard at some of these other departments? Because it's going to take this meeting, this discussion right into the budget process. And I would hate to get to the budget meetings and start asking questions, because I'll tell you, this is going to be one really different budget process. You know, I mean, I don't want to go every single line item through that budget, but I'm going to tell you, we better find a way to cut. And in order to do it, we're going to have some hard discussions on, one, are there efficiencies? And two, are there things we can cut out? And cutting certain things out may or may not affect a level of service and services that we provide. But, you know, so I just don't want to not ask for something that in a month or 3 weeks, we're sitting in a meeting going, gee, I wish we had said to staff, look into this. That's all. And I don't really understand, like, what you're saying. I'm not getting it. You know, fine, Parks and Recs is real easy to tear apart. But what about the other departments? Are there areas we should dig deeper in? Should staff really be looking at this? And
If I may, Mayor, because I think it was
Please.
part of my floor that we had the conversation,
Right.
because I see other folks on the thing. Number one, as part of this exercise, it was recommended that we cancel some services because of low utilization. So I see as part of your concern is being addressed by the current exercise. But I totally agree, there are other areas of the city where it's not a user fee situation. So it's different from Parks and Rec. But efficiency, so again, Commissioner Duval talked to this quite a bit. Certainly there are other departments too where we really need to make sure, are we providing some things where, you know, if we stopped providing them, fewer than 10 people would shed a tear, you know, and there's cost associated with it. So definitely, I think that will need to be part of the budget conversation. Yeah, I think it's more of an efficiency kind of conversation.
Commissioner Duval.
Really, I want to just make a comment about what Commissioner Langdon spoke about. And again, I do not want to be picking on Parks and Rec, but if you talk about the fact that we do have 2 gymnasiums, and there are businesses that provide the same service. Number one, when the business provides the service, we're going to get revenue from that in tax income. And at the same time, we're going to be relieved from the cost of providing that same service. So, you know, not in this particular case, you know, to pick on it, I just want to go along with Commissioner Langdon that there are services that private businesses can provide and take away the cost of the city doing that. And then, as I said, to get away from Parks and Rec and maybe pick on a different department, poor fire chief is sitting here right in my eyesight. Doesn't the fire department go to people's homes and change batteries on fire alarms? And if we do, does the city charge that resident?
Good morning, Scott Titus, Fire Rescue Chief for the Fire Rescue District. In response to your question, yes, we do. And actually, one of the things that we're doing in our budget right now and upcoming, we're looking at how we do that in a manner that is less responsive to each individual citizen and more responsive to our scheduling, because we're running into a strain right now with the amount of training that's required for our people and all the things that we're doing. So we're looking at, you were talking about efficiencies. We're looking at how we do that better. We're looking at dedicating 1 day a week instead of when they call. The difference to that being is if smoke detectors are beeping by telephone, oftentimes we don't know whether they're beeping because there's a low battery or are they beeping because there's an issue in the house. So of course, we're always going to err on the side of caution there. In response to the overall thing, this is what we do through the budget process every year. By the time the budget gets to you, I promise the city manager has really pushed, and we've gone through a lot of exercises on how do we look at all those things. One of the things the city manager has implemented that we've all worked on is, and you all have seen them, is our performance measures. Our performance measures speak directly to those efficiencies and the things and the difference that we're making in the community. If you go back years ago, there was not as many user fees. The reason user fees came was previous commissions directed and said, we would like you to develop more fees to recover some of the costs specifically targeted towards the people that are utilizing those services. So they weren't a complete offset. They were just so that it was one of those things so that they didn't have to increase the millage rate as much that year or other things, and to more directly allocate that cost. So there's a lot that goes through that, but I do assure you, we look at efficiencies every day in everything we do. How can we do it better? Cost for everybody that's in the community watching this is the same as for all of us providing the service. Our costs go up for repairs on apparatus, for equipment, for everything else. And so we continue to tighten our belt and do those things, I assure you, but we'll continue to do so and find ways to do better.
Thank you.
Hope that answers your question.
City manager?
Yeah, I just wanted to finish off the comment back that we were talking about. We were only referring to, when I asked you about the Parks and Rec and the building, the user fees of what you're talking about today. The entire budget and everything that we're going to look at, by no means are we saying that that will not be reviewed as it should be throughout the entire budget, just the conversation from today.
Thank you. Commissioner Petro.
A quick question to our consultant and to the staff. So when you did take a look at the Parks and Rec user fee recovery, you did not take into consideration the buildings, correct?
The maintenance of the building is taken into consideration. The capital cost of the building is, I don't know of a way how to really include the capital cost for an individual person using a room inside the building for half an hour. I'm sure you could take the total depreciation, divide by total hours of usage, divide by the members, people of that day, divide by the square footage of that room. But that is not a way that it's usually done. It's usually done based on the maintenance of those assets, and that is included in our calculation.
So maintenance is included?
Yes, sir.
From the accounting point of view, and correct me if I'm wrong, don't we use the depreciation, and that comes back to the city manager's comment? I mean, we do have to take into account not only the hours per user, but we can count the total hours of the week. And to include the depreciation, do we have to do this, or do we look into that as far as depreciation cost? Or simply for maintaining those buildings as they age?
So in a government, depreciation is not used until you get to the government-wide financial statements. What you're looking at, I think you're looking to apply that charge to a fee that only, a fee that benefits just one person. That I can think of, there's no building I can think of that is provided for that type of situation. There's a building that's used because it exists for other purposes. Their primary fire and EMS, they're here to provide those services. Now, do they do inspections? Could there, I don't see how you could take the cost of that building and apply it to just that we provide inspections and that fee, because that building has to exist for their primary purpose.
That's what you want?
Well,
Or-
just the kind of, I think what would be the perfect example is Warm Mineral Springs. You know, we don't want to raise the prices because of the condition of the property. We're about to spend $10 million restoring those buildings, upgrading the property. When we consider a fee schedule for that asset, it's clearly, as I look at this policy consideration slide, it is clearly in the individual benefit category. When we look at our user fees, I would like to see a depreciation of that $10 million over the life of those buildings. You pick it, 20 years, 30 years, whatever, so that we really understand the cost of that asset. And again, we may or may not choose to amp up the user fees as a result of that, but we need to understand what it costs. And cost recovery, I mean, I'll tell you, it could significantly impact the user fees of Warm Mineral Springs if we chose as a body to go 100% cost recapture. And again, I think we've done the community a disservice in the past when we have said Warm Mineral Springs pays for itself. It doesn't. We never once considered property maintenance costs, depreciating the $5.5 million the city paid to acquire that asset. And now another $10 million to bring that property to where it should be. We need to understand if we're charging user fees, what the real cost of delivering that service to a very limited number of people, because as this chart says, if we're subsidizing those individual user fees out of property taxes, we need to understand that at a policy level. We're burdening everybody with those costs in order to keep the costs low for the small group of people who are really using that asset. We just need to understand it.
I agree with you, but for the cost recovery, it's probably not related. But for us, as a board, to be transparent, we do have to see that. With only one exception, I do not agree that you said pick a number. The depreciation has to be a certain number of years as a guideline.
20 or 30. It's a
Whatever the
choice.
county right now is
Yeah.
specifying. So we do need to know the depreciation costs so we can
Yeah.
know exact cost of that building. But from the consultant's presentation, I don't think it's relevant to take into effect as a user fee recovery, whatever increase or decrease.
City manager.
Just to piggyback on Commissioner Langdon's point, when we say Warm Mineral Springs and the $10 million that we're using to fix that, that is not property tax or taxpayers' money. That's the excess, and I believe there might be some surtax money in there, but it's not the global community paying to renovate Warm Mineral Springs.
If I may,
Yes, ma'am.
when we spend money, even if it's Parks and Rec impact fees, when we spend that money on Warm Mineral Springs, we're not spending it somewhere else. We're not using that money to defray the cost of new jungle gym equipment or, restoring a park or maintaining our playing fields. So even though it's not property tax, it's all related. It's a tax. And whenever we have used surtax to create something that's nice to have, we have made a decision to not spend that money on something we need to have. That's a policy choice. And depending upon how you decide that, you live with the consequences. And I think we would all agree that today this city is living with the consequences of 30, 40, 50 years of decisions and non-decisions. It's got to stop. Off the box.
Commissioner Duval.
As I'm sitting here, I had a thought.
Thoughts are good.
We need to vote.
The mayor
as to
spoke
whether or not
early
we
on in
share
this
that.
meeting about we've got to tighten the belt. It occurred to me, we have 900 city employees. And I've been in office just over 90 days. And in those 90 days, I have conversed, met with, in some cases worked with quite a few city employees. And I'm pretty impressed with the city employees that we have and what they do. And it occurred to me that as part of belt tightening, wouldn't it be nice if we could have some kind of an awards program for all the employees in this city, that if they come up with some idea that saves this city some money, maybe they get some sort of a reward for that, like a share of some of the savings? Just a thought.
I like it.
Anything else here, my fellow commissioners? It's, this is a good discussion, I think. I hope everyone listening takes it in the spirit in which these conversations were offered. We do have lots of challenges in lots of areas this year, and, the idea is always to do the best for the most. It's always to be the best stewards of our citizens' tax dollars. And, we're asking a lot of our citizens. We have, because we are growing, we are challenged, and we're trying to do the best we can to balance the costs of all this growth and to make sure that those who will benefit from them, even those who have not yet even thought to move to this city, whether it be citizens or businesses, that they pay their fair share too. So, it is a challenge, and we can't forget that part of what we do is to provide a quality of life. We have a set of pillars that this city rests on, and we can't slash away at any one so severely that it destabilizes this city. Part of the reason people have come here, part of the reason why Northport's so attractive and it's the most livable city in this state, is because we offer a quality of life that not a lot of other cities do. And so we have to be real careful to maintain the character. At the same time, do it in the most cost-effective way. Because as we've all heard today, there are those services we all share in, or from time to time we may all share in. There are others that are very particular to likes and interests of certain citizens. And there's a balancing act here. So, as we move forward, we have to do it with deliberation and with thought, but also with a bit of heart and humanity, because this needs to be a careful balance. And so, I personally appreciate the conversation. It's hard to know where this was going to go, where we're just going to go, okay, here you go, staff, go digest this and fit it into the budget somehow. But there were some real good conversations, and I hope the citizens who listen understand some of the challenges we have in trying to see how all this fits together. So again, unless anyone has anything else, city staff, is there any better direction you want from us? What are you looking for a specific consensus?
So I think we heard that you would like us to explore what the changes would look like based on the consultant's recommendations. We'll bring that back to you as we continue to put together the budget and make it part of the assumptions that you have to choose from in the near future.
All right, so you guys are good. It's a great presentation. I really appreciate it. And staff, for those of you who spoke up, and for Parks and Recs who stood strong, we do appreciate everything Parks and Recs offers this city and its citizens. Please do not think that is not the case. despite that you hang a little lower on the tree, doesn't mean like that you are not every bit as important to this city as every other department here. So, you know, we'll work our way through this process. If there's nothing else, I guess, thought I was gonna ask, you thought I'd forget about public comments. City clerk, we have any public comments? Good Lord. Well, with that, any general public comments? Well then, if there be nothing more to this, it is 11:46, and I'll adjourn this meeting.
Thank you for having me here.